I was at a small airport waiting for my connecting flight. It was one of those almost forgotten places, with only a few people around and long, silent corridors. My gate was nearly empty, except for one or two passengers sitting far apart. I used the time to check my phone and sip on a coffee, trying to stave off the boredom. That's when I noticed the suitcase. It was sitting next to the chairs near my gate, completely unattended. It was medium-sized, black, and had no stickers or visible identification. I looked around, expecting someone to return for it, but no one seemed to care. At first, I thought it was normal in such a quiet place, but something about it felt off. I decided to report the suitcase to the gate agent, who seemed more interested in his computer than in hearing my concerns. It's probably just something someone forgot. If nobody picks it up, we'll deal with it later, he said without even glancing up. I went back to my seat, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. But a few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Why did you touch my suitcase?" it read. My blood ran cold. I instinctively looked around, but no one was staring at me or acting suspicious. It was as if the walls themselves were watching. My heart raced as I reread the message, trying to make sense of how someone knew I had approached the suitcase. I didn't remember touching it. I had only walked close when reporting it. I scanned the area again, this time more carefully. The few people at the gate seemed preoccupied, looking at their phones or reading. No one appeared to be paying attention to me, which only heightened my paranoia. I decided to ignore the message, blocked the number, and tried to focus on the boarding announcement that was about to begin. Then, another message arrived. "You shouldn't have done that." This time, panic began to set in. I glanced at the suitcase again. It was still there, motionless and unassuming, just as before. I got up and went to the gate agent again, more determined this time. I explained that I was receiving strange messages about the suitcase. He frowned but still seemed skeptical. "Okay, let's take a look," he said with a sigh, getting up reluctantly. But before he could move, my phone buzzed again. "See for yourself. Just be careful." The agent glanced at me as my face went pale. Before we could do anything, the boarding announcement began. The sound of the boarding announcement felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of my heart. Even so, the people around me started lining up. I remained frozen, staring at my phone, waiting for another message to come through. "See for yourself. Just be careful." What did that mean? I looked back at the suitcase, still sitting there, but now it felt menacing, as if it were waiting for something. The gate agent grew impatient with my hesitation. "Are you coming or not?" he asked as other passengers filed past him with their boarding passes. Reluctantly, I joined the line, but the unease continued to build. As I moved closer to the gate, another message arrived. "I see you in line." My eyes darted around, searching for anyone watching me, but everyone seemed focused on boarding. Feeling trapped, I showed my boarding pass and walked down the jet bridge. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the door of the plane, I received a final message. "I'll see you on the plane." Fear gripped me, and I knew something terrible was about to happen. I boarded the plane with sweaty palms and my mind racing. Every face I saw seemed suspicious. Who could be sending these messages? Could they be sitting near me? When I reached my seat, somewhere in the middle of the plane, I quickly sat down and began discreetly watching the other passengers as they boarded. One by one, they passed carrying bags and backpacks, but no one seemed to notice me. Then my phone vibrated again. I almost didn't want to look, but curiosity won over fear. The message read, "Do you like your seat?" I looked around, trying not to appear obvious, but I saw no one looking in my direction. Panic surged through me. The unknown sender knew exactly where I was sitting, which meant they were on the plane. Moments later, a flight attendant carried the suitcase I had reported onto the plane and placed it in the overhead compartment a few rows ahead. My heart was in my throat. Though I wanted to scream, I forced myself to remain silent, trying to understand what was happening. As the last passengers boarded, my anxiety skyrocketed. I carefully observed each person, searching for any sign of who might be threatening me. When the flight attendant walked by, I thought about telling them about the messages, but fear held me back. Maybe it was the fear of looking paranoid or the thought that saying something might escalate the situation. So, I stayed silent, watching as the plane's doors were finally closed. Shortly after takeoff, my phone vibrated again. "Hope you're comfortable." My eyes darted to the overhead compartment where the suitcase now sat. Whoever was behind this knew exactly where I was and seemed to be enjoying my fear. I couldn't wait any longer. I discreetly signaled a flight attendant and explained what was happening, showing her the messages. Her expression shifted to concern immediately. "I'll let the captain know," she said before quickly heading to the cockpit. The flight attendant returned with another crew member. They asked me to explain the situation in more detail. I recounted everything: the abandoned suitcase, the messages, and how they became more threatening after I boarded. The crew took my report seriously and began acting discreetly. One crew member informed the captain, while another checked the overhead compartment holding the suitcase. A few minutes later, a decision was made. The plane would return to the airport as a precaution. As the captain announced the diversion, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers murmured in confusion, unaware of the real reason for the change. I continued scanning the faces around me, desperate to identify the sender of the messages. Then, another text came through: "You shouldn't have done that." It was now undeniable. The person knew the plane was returning and was on board. The final message froze my blood. The confirmation that the person was on the plane made the air feel suffocating. The flight attendant returned, asking me to stay calm while another crew member discreetly began checking the passengers' phones. The plane continued its return, and every minute felt like an eternity. My eyes darted from face to face, looking for any reaction, but no one stood out. When the plane finally landed, security personnel boarded swiftly, taking over the situation. Passengers were instructed to remain seated while authorities checked identities and searched the cabin. As they opened the compartment to retrieve the suitcase, chaos erupted. A man sitting a few rows ahead abruptly stood up and tried to bolt down the aisle. The scene was chaotic and swift. Security intercepted the man before he could get far. He struggled briefly but was quickly restrained and handcuffed. The murmurs and anxious glances from the passengers filled the cabin as the man was escorted off the plane. When the suitcase was inspected, its contents turned out to be ordinary clothes and personal items, but the man's behavior and the threatening messages pointed to his intent to incite panic. Although the immediate threat was over, the emotional toll lingered. I chose not to reboard that day and spent the night at a nearby hotel, trying to process the ordeal. Since then, I've approached air travel with a caution I never had before, constantly aware of my surroundings and questioning what might seem out of place. Traveling for work had always been part of my routine, so flight delays and nights spent in airports weren't new to me. But that night felt different. My flight had been delayed for hours due to an unexpected storm, leaving me stuck in a nearly deserted terminal. The place was under renovation, with partially blocked corridors and some areas completely dark. There were only a few travelers left, and most disappeared as flights were rescheduled. By midnight, I realized I was almost entirely alone. I tried to distract myself with my phone, but the silence in the terminal was more unsettling than I wanted to admit. Tired of waiting, I got up to find an outlet near one of the gates. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the echo of my own steps, but they continued even after I stopped. I looked around, but no one was there. Just rows of empty chairs and flickering lights from the ongoing renovations. I decided to ignore it and moved to another gate further away, trying not to feed my imagination. A few minutes later, as I reached into my pocket, I felt something under the chair. It was a small piece of paper. Curious, I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwritten words sent a chill down my spine. "You're completely alone now." My heart raced as I read those words. I scanned the area again, hoping to spot a prankster or another passenger, but the terminal remained empty. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was something left by someone earlier, just a piece of trash. But the handwriting looked fresh, and the paper was neither crumpled nor dirty. Still, I decided to ignore it and move to a gate further away, this time closer to a well-lit area. I thought that might ease my nerves, but the relief was short-lived. A few minutes later, while rummaging through my backpack, I noticed something odd on the seat beside me. Another piece of paper. My stomach churned as I opened it. "Do you think you're safe here?" the message read. I dropped the paper immediately and looked around frantically for any sign of someone else. There was nothing. The terminal seemed even emptier than before. The oppressive silence and isolation weighed heavily on me. Whoever was leaving these notes was stealthy, invisible, and that made it all the more terrifying. The tension became unbearable. Sitting still was no longer an option. I stood up quickly and began walking through the terminal, trying to project confidence, though my heart was pounding like a drum. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the corridors, but soon I noticed something that made me freeze. There were other footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable, following mine. I stopped abruptly, and the footsteps stopped too. My entire body went rigid as I scanned the area again. Nothing but empty chairs, construction barriers, and flickering lights in the distance. I decided to walk again, this time faster, heading toward the area where I knew there were still some airport staff. The footsteps resumed, closer this time. Each step felt calculated, as if the person was playing a game with me. When I reached the information desk, it was empty. Even the staff had gone, likely to a break room or elsewhere. That's when I saw it. Another piece of paper lying on the desk. My hand shook as I picked it up. "You can't run from me," it read, written in the same neat handwriting. That was it. I grabbed my phone and called airport security. As I waited for security to answer, I backed against a wall, trying to steady my breathing. The call seemed to take forever to connect, or maybe time was just dragging under the weight of my fear. Finally, someone answered, and I quickly explained what was happening. The person on the other end tried to reassure me, promising to send someone immediately to check the terminal. As I spoke, I scanned the area again, but everything still appeared empty, or so it seemed. Then I heard another sound. Not footsteps this time, but something falling, like a small object, near one of the gates behind me. I turned slowly and walked toward the noise, curiosity briefly overpowering fear. When I reached the gate, I saw another piece of paper on the ground, as though it had just been dropped there. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe as I picked it up. "You're going exactly where I want you to." The words rang in my head like a warning, and at that moment, I knew I needed to get out of there immediately. Holding the note with trembling hands, I struggled to decide what to do. I knew wandering through the terminal made me more vulnerable. I decided to return to the main area, where there were more lights and security cameras. I walked quickly, ignoring the persistent feeling of being watched, though it was nearly impossible to shake. Each step seemed accompanied by another, fainter but undeniably present. When I reached a more open area near the boarding gates, I spun around abruptly, hoping to catch someone. Once again, there was no one. My phone buzzed again, and a shiver ran down my spine. This time, the message read, "Now you have nowhere to run." I froze. Footsteps suddenly quickened behind me. I turned instinctively, but before I could react, airport security finally arrived. 2 guards rushed toward me, alerted by my call. I quickly explained what had been happening, showing them the messages and the notes. They immediately began searching the terminal. One guard stayed with me while the other combed the area where I'd heard the last sound. While the security team searched, I stayed close to one of the guards, trying to recount everything as clearly as possible. He asked rapid-fire questions. "Did you see anyone? Do you remember any details about the notes?" But my mind was elsewhere. I still felt like we were being watched. The terminal felt larger than ever, the shadows stretching unnervingly down the half-renovated corridors. The oppressive silence was broken only by the guards' voices over their radios. After a few minutes, the other guard returned, holding something in his hand. It was a crumpled piece of paper he'd found in a nearby corridor. He opened it in front of me. "You got lucky this time," it read. My stomach turned. The guards assured me they would conduct a thorough sweep of the terminal and review security footage. But for now, no one had been found. I decided not to wait around to find out what might happen next. I rescheduled my flight for the next morning and spent the rest of the night in the main airport area, surrounded by people and lights. Though I never discovered who was following me, that night taught me to always stay alert, especially in places where silence feels alive. I've always been a relaxed traveler, the type who enjoys long layovers and short connections to unwind and watch the hustle and bustle of airports. That day, I was traveling to a remote town for work, and the final leg of my journey was a small connecting flight. When boarding was announced, everything seemed normal. The plane was a smaller model with only a handful of passengers, which made sense for that destination. The gate agent quickly checked my ticket and waved me through without even making eye contact. I climbed the stairs to the plane, feeling the fatigue of the trip but ready to complete the last stretch to my destination. As soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The seats were disorganized, and the numbers didn't match those on my boarding pass. Some were draped with cloths, as if broken or out of service, and there was an odd smell inside, something between mildew and cleaning chemicals. When I asked the flight attendant about my seat, she hurriedly glanced at my ticket, pointed to any empty spot, and quickly walked away. Her expression was tense, and her demeanor felt oddly unprofessional, as if she wasn't used to dealing with passengers. I sat down, trying to shake off the discomfort, but I couldn't help noticing that the other passengers seemed just as uneasy, murmuring to each other and glancing around with the same apprehension I felt. As the plane took off, the sense of unease only deepened. The safety instructions were rushed and barely audible, as if the crew didn't care or didn't know what they were doing. The pilot made no announcements, something that always happens even on the smallest flights. I tried to focus on something else to distract myself, but everything seemed out of place. The other passengers were equally tense, some exchanging nervous glances, others fidgeting with their phones. That's when I decided to check my ticket again and compare the seat numbers around me. Nothing made sense. Curious and now slightly frightened, I decided to ask one of the flight attendants about the flight's destination. She paused for a moment, as if trying to decide what to say. "We're heading to the final destination on the itinerary," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When I pressed further, mentioning the name of the town I was supposed to be flying to, she simply repeated, "Don't worry, we're in control." Something about her tone sent a chill down my spine. I pulled out my phone to check the flight details on the airport's website, but there was no information, nothing about the flight or its destination. My heart began to race. Where exactly were we going? As the plane cruised through the sky, the tension in the cabin grew heavier. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, and some began directly questioning the attendants. Every question was met with vague answers or forced smiles. Something was definitely wrong. I turned to the man sitting next to me and asked if he knew anything. "I'm just as confused," he said nervously. "I was supposed to be going somewhere nearby, but nothing about this feels right." That's when I noticed something else unsettling. The in-flight monitors, which usually display information like altitude or route, were turned off. The cabin felt eerily devoid of any information. Driven by desperation, I decided to confront one of the attendants. I walked to the small galley at the back of the plane, where two crew members were speaking in hushed tones. They immediately went silent when they saw me, exchanging glances that only deepened my dread. "We need to know where this plane is going," I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. One of them finally broke the silence. "Please return to your seat, sir. Everything will be explained in due time." The response only made me more anxious. As I returned to my seat, a new idea occurred to me. Maybe I could figure something out by looking outside. But when I peered out the window, all I saw was darkness. No city lights, no recognizable landmarks. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in the strange silence of the cabin. It felt like all the passengers were realizing, simultaneously, that something was terribly wrong. Some whispered to each other, but no one seemed to have answers. I tried to send a quick message to a friend, explaining the situation, but the weak internet signal wouldn't let it go through. I glanced at the other passengers and noticed that many were also trying to make calls or send messages, their faces filled with frustration and fear. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. One passenger got up and walked toward the cockpit door, banging on it and demanding answers. No one responded. Suddenly, two attendants appeared and forcibly escorted him back to his seat, muttering something I couldn't hear. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Back in my seat, I curled up, trying to process what was happening. Then, I heard the sound of something falling in the aisle. It was a bag, seemingly left behind by accident, and from it slipped an ID badge. I picked it up quickly, and what I read made my blood run cold. It didn't belong to any airline I recognized. I held the badge in my hand, trying to process what it meant. The name on it was unfamiliar, and the logo looked generic, almost as if it belonged to a made-up or temporary company. My instincts screamed that something was horribly wrong. Before I could return the badge, one of the attendants approached me, his expression cold and calculating. "That's not for you," he said, snatching the badge from my hand. His voice was low but carried enough menace to make me sit down without protest. As I tried to calm myself, another passenger, a few rows ahead, began raising his voice. "This isn't right. Someone needs to tell us where we're going." A flight attendant quickly approached him, trying to defuse the situation, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Taking advantage of the distraction, I looked out the window again. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. We weren't heading anywhere familiar. Below us, there was only complete darkness, no signs of civilization. At that moment, the pilot spoke over the intercom for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're on course for our final destination." His voice was unnervingly calm, as if it were a statement of inevitability. The lights flickered briefly, throwing the cabin into momentary darkness. When they came back on, one of the attendants walked down the aisle, his demeanor more serious and determined than before. He stopped at my row and looked directly at me, saying nothing but making it clear. They knew I had found something I shouldn't have. The descent began without warning. Looking out the window, I saw a dimly lit airstrip surrounded by dense forest. It was clear this wasn't a regular landing. My heart raced as the wheels hit the ground with a jarring thud, the plane shaking as it came to a stop. Outside, uniformed figures waited in the shadows. As names were called, passengers were led away one by one. When my name was called, survival instincts took over. I ran into the darkness, weaving through the trees until I found a road where a passing truck saved me. I'll never forget that night. The badge disappeared during my escape, and no airline recognized the flight. I'll never trust normal flights again.